Welcome in to the New Orleans Pelicans Podcast, the official podcast of your New Orleans Pelicans. A podcast dedicated to everything you need to know about the squad. Hear from players, coaches, broadcasters, and those who cover the NBA on a daily basis. It's time to flock up. The New Orleans Pelicans Podcast starts right now.
All right, and if you can even believe it, a new NBA season is here. The New Orleans Pelicans Podcast, the official podcast of your New Orleans Pelicans, it is back. I'm Gus Kattengell. Super excited to be back with y'all again another season. Super excited to have, I don't know, I was going to say my Robin, my partner in crime, but really you're the one that runs. I've learned this, being an official Pelicans employee now for almost a month. You are Mr. Pelican himself. I don't know if you knew that. Jim
Well, thank
Eichenhofer.
you, Gus. That's quite an introduction, yeah. No, I appreciate it. I think sometimes when I take the ball and I go one-on-one, I think I want to reduce that a little bit this year now that you're fully on board with us. I don't want to say, Gus, clear out. This is my game. This is my offense, my shot. But I'm really looking forward to this season, and I'm looking forward to doing the podcast. We'll be on a regular schedule soon, but we're really going heavy this week, every single day from training camp in Nashville. So
yeah, looking forward to it because we are here and over to our left in our very, very nice hotel room here in downtown Nashville. Mr. Todd Graffagnini, voice of your New Orleans Pelicans. Joel Myers, AD's here. We're all here. We just got literally back from practice as we're recording this just before 2 p.m. in the afternoon. Practice 1 of 2 on the day, but we were just kind of talking about it, setting it up, Todd. Hard to believe another season is here. It is here. They just had practice.
No doubt about it. Look, you get through the 82 games, and, of course, last year Pelicans made the play-in tournament, then the playoffs themselves, and you have the offseason, and the offseason goes a lot quicker than you think because here we are. This is really officially the first day of what we hope is going to be a 7, 8, maybe a 9-month grind, and that's what it's all about. But, no, it really is hard to believe that we are watching Pelicans Training Camp now, and we're into it.
No doubt, we definitely are into it, and I think one of the things, Todd, that really stands out more than anything else is there are a handful of storylines, to say the least, when you look at this season coming into it. Guys, we just jotted down some things that I think kind of make sense. First and foremost, I think something that a lot of Pels fans are going to ask, who's the starting lineup? And why should we kind of maybe look at it a little bit differently this year? Todd, start with you.
I just don't think at this particular juncture that is an important thing on Willie Green's checklist right now. You've got to implement everything offensively, defensively, get your personnel straight before you can worry about who the quote-unquote starters are. At this particular point of training camp, that's not really a top priority. You've got to find out what you got out there. I mean, you've got a different roster than we've been used to the last couple of years. So getting everything straight there is top priority, and then you'll get into it after this camp. You've got 4 preseason games. That's how you start to work in who's going to, quote, start. But, look, Gus, I mean, you think about it, the starting lineup has the potential of being different every night. And it really isn't about who starts. It's about who finishes, especially if you think about the last couple of years where the Pelicans have struggled in clutch situations. So right now it is about feeling out the team, and Willie Green and his staff, I guarantee they're going to be looking at film of today's about an hour and 40-minute practice before the scrimmage tonight and just seeing what they thought worked. But right now you got 20-plus guys out on the court.
Yeah. And Jim, I was kind of thinking, as I get your take on this, it's almost like a baseball thing. I know you love your baseball. You're watching baseball over on the flight over here. But in baseball, you have starters. You have middle relievers. You have closers. Graff, I know you're a baseball guy here too, but you have setup men on the offensive side. You got pinch hitter guys that come in, lefty versus lefty guys, depending who their starter is. Is that how maybe we should look at the Pels roster this year?
It could be. I thought it was interesting on Media Day that Willie Green talked about how he hasn't really committed to even the idea that there's going to be the same starting lineup every night. I mean, he basically said that ideally that's what you want to have, but that's not something that they're going to necessarily commit to. And if you listen to the way that he's described certain players already, maybe some of the role players, some of the guys that aren't going to maybe play 40, 35 minutes a game, it does sound like there's going to be a bunch of situations where, based on the opponent, this guy might play more in this game than he does on another night. So, I mean, I definitely think it's something that's pretty fluid, but it is really interesting to follow, not just during training camp, but when they start playing preseason games, of what lineups they put out there and where they go from there.
And Todd, does it make sense when you look at the Western Conference and how tough it's going to be and where the NBA is? I mean, every night you have to play, and you're going to be playing teams that have some solid players and stars and starters and stuff. And then you look at the last 2 years, one game has made a difference in the standings for the Pelicans. So the ability perhaps to match up or to take advantage of whoever it is that you're playing, I know it's not the norm how we've looked at it, but that could be a strength.
It is now because, look, every game's important. There are no nights off. You saw it last year, and really a couple of years now, where the Pelicans' difference between being in the play-in and the playoffs came down to literally the final Sunday of the regular season. Mm-hmm. It's crazy about, you think about the NFL and how every Sunday is so important. You've got 17 games, and you think about now the NBA season, all 82 means something. And even yesterday, the final day of the baseball season, which really wasn't the final day of the baseball season, right, because the Mets and Braves had to play a doubleheader, and the final two playoff positions, the final playoff position was game 162. All of those games, and it came down to one. And that's why you have to go, and it's, human nature. Oh, boy, we're tired. We might take tonight off. That could be the difference between being a 7 seed and a 6 seed, or a 6 and a 5, or home court advantage. So you got to bring it every night, and the matchups are going to dictate who's on the court every single night.
Baseball is starting to experience what the NBA has forever, where you start expanding the playoff field, and there's more teams that are let in. So every single game does end up meaning more, and you have situations like what you talked about with the Mets and the Braves. One of the things that CJ McCollum talked about on Media Day was that, and I don't think this necessarily applies to the East nearly as much as it does to the West, but he mentioned how bad losses really hurt you. If you're in the Western Conference, and he mentioned he went back and looked at, they lost a couple games to Memphis. We know Memphis is probably going to come back with a vengeance this year, but the state that the Grizzlies were in last year, where they had so many guys out, unfortunately not always out when they played against the Pelicans, that Ja Morant played 2 of his 9 games, but nonetheless, I thought that was an interesting way to put it, that, if you're in the position that the Pelicans in, or a bunch of these teams in the Western Conference, in April, you don't want to look back and say that game we lost in November to a team that is at the bottom of the standings was the reason that we didn't get where we wanted to, or get the seed that we ended up with.
The Pelicans did a pretty good job about that, especially against Eastern Conference opponents.
Right.
Now, the Western Conference, it was a little bit different, even though we did really take advantage of what happened with Portland last year. But, I mean, think about it. San Antonio.
A couple to Utah Houston, in the beginning of the season. Yep.
Utah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Look, you could have used those games down, and the 2 against Memphis, obviously. But Ja Morant played in those games. So it was a much different Western Conference opponent as far as Memphis. Is the Western Conference that good this year, where is the Western Conference going to beat up on each other, or is the Western Conference basically going to feast on the majority of the Eastern Conference and make things very difficult?
Yeah, I mean, that's going to be interesting. I think a lot of people, if you just look objectively nationally, a lot of people think there's 13 teams in the West that think they have a chance to make the playoffs. So, I mean, we'll see. If the East actually did get a little bit more competitive against the West going back a couple of years, but then last year it flipped back to the way we've seen it for, 20 years. I just wish that we were back to where the East was a little bit more competitive, so that it wasn't as rugged as it is. But, I mean, I don't think any team in the West is going to go into this season thinking, we can kind of walk our way. We can kind of slowly find our stride. You need to be on top of your game by, Thanksgiving at the very latest, or you're going to it's going to be costly later, I think.
Yeah, no doubt. I think something else that's going to be interesting to me, and we'll maybe delve into it a little more coming up in our second segment, Dejounte Murray, new Pelican. We haven't really seen him, so that's obviously a topic coming into it. We're going to touch a little bit more, but when you heard it, he was going to be a Pel, Todd. You've called his games. You've seen him. You've seen his impact against the Pelicans. What did you think of immediately when you knew Dejounte Murray was a Pel?
Well, we had a very small sample size today in about an hour and 45 minutes, but I think we would all be in agreement after watching today's practice that he is going to make a tremendous impact, and not really on the offensive end, but especially on the defensive end, where he is a first-team all-defensive player. And when you put that guy out there with Herb Jones, you got two all-team, all-first-team defenders out there. It is going to be extremely difficult for opponents, no matter who's on the court for the Pelicans, where you have a traditional big or not. Those guys are capable of guarding any position on the floor because of their length and their wingspan and their ability to deflect passes, their ability to get steals. Again, very small sample size, but I'm just extremely happy that Dejounte Murray is now wearing a Pelican.
Yeah, we're going to get into our practice observations, and Todd just gave you a preview of what probably mine is. But I have next to Dejounte Murray, Jim, running the show, defense, leadership. When you heard Dejounte Murray's a Pelican, first thing to your mind was?
I was very pleased, and the fact that they got him without trading any of the top, starters or top 6-7 guys from last year's team was surprising to me in a good way. It was similar to the way I felt when they acquired C.J. McCollum. It was the kind of thing where it was like you didn't necessarily – you might have heard rumors that this player on a certain team somewhere else in the NBA was available, but you didn't necessarily think like, oh, yeah, he's going to come to the Pelicans. So from that standpoint, similar to when they traded for C.J. McCollum, I was very kind of taken aback like, whoa, this is a quality player that they've added. And I think, I'm sure we're going to get into some of the specifics of what he brings, but just that might be the thing that I'm the most excited for to watch at the beginning of the regular season and even during preseason, if just the impact that he's going to have on the whole team overall.
Three other storylines, I guess, going into training camp, guys. Who is the team starting center? I feel like I've been asked that at a grocery store, pumping gas, at the gym, on the team. But, I mean, everyone's kind of wondering about that a little bit, huh, Graff?
I don't think we're going to find that out until all of camp and all of the preseason games. I think that is going to be a situation that's going to be in flux. I really do. And, again, I don't think Willie Green is really worried about that right now. He's trying to get – look, I don't want to get too ahead of myself, but the hardest job that Willie Green is going to have this year is trying to put all these combinations together. I mean, you saw it today. I mean, the Pelicans are going to have a lot of depth. How you get that depth to mesh is I think is going to be Willie Green's really most important task of this season. But as far as who's going to be the quote-unquote 5, we're not going to find that out for a couple of weeks.
I like the fact that the centers that they have on the roster, I feel like they all have skills that are complementary to the scorers and the offensive weapons that the Pelicans have. One of the things that Daniel Tice talked about on Media Day was he feels like he doesn't need the ball, that he can contribute in a bunch of different ways. We saw him do this for Germany during the Olympics where they had the Wagner brothers on the team. They had Dennis Schroeder, a bunch of other guys that are even in the NBA are scorers.
Yeah.
And he can contribute a bunch on rebounding. He's a good, screen setter. He's a shot blocker, that kind of thing. So I think if you look at Daniel Tice and you look at the other centers, I think what they all can bring is that areas that you're not looking for from some of your top scorers. So I think that they're guys that can play well off of the other weapons that the Pelicans have. And Tice just talked about how that was something that made the Pelicans attractive. I mean, you want to play with some of the talent that this team has if you're a center like him.
One of these starting center, obviously being one of the storylines there, team goals, Graff. That's got to be another, I guess, topic going into training camp. But what should be the expectation level for this team, its fans?
Get out of the play-in. Look, that's really been the goal the last couple of years. And you think how close the Pelicans were to not being in the play-in.
To hosting a first round.
Look, again, I go 2 years ago, the last Sunday in Minnesota. I mean, that was the difference between being a 7 seed and being the 9 seed, where you have 2 opportunities at it. Last year, the final home game against the Lakers, that was the difference between being the 7 seed and the 6 seed and being out of the play-in. So, and to me, again, I did not feel that the Pelicans were a play-in team last year. It worked out that way because of the tiebreak against the Suns. But the Pelicans were a 54-55 win team that were not able to finish ball games. 49 is a pretty good number, especially if you go back. That's the amount of wins the Pelicans had last year. If you go back the last couple of years, that's the most wins the Pels have had in a long time, Jim.
15 years,
as you well know. So you think if you close some of these games, you're not even worried about what happened in the last day of the regular season, and worry about a tiebreak with the Phoenix Suns, and worried about Sacramento. You know, I'll never forget it, walking back from Chase Center after we beat Golden State on that Friday night, and you're pulling for Sacramento because if they beat Phoenix, we're in the playoffs, and it didn't happen. So you got to take all that out, but I just, and that it's going to come back to Dejounte Murray running the show in these clutch situations, man.
I can't wait to get to that. Go ahead.
I mean, my goals are, like Graff said, to be in the top 6, I think would be a step forward. To be much more competitive in the playoffs after what happened last year would be a big step.
Right.
And I'm not sitting here in October and saying that you have to go to the Western Conference Finals or you have to, do what some of the teams in the West did last year exactly. But to me, to make a jump forward the way Minnesota and Dallas did, Dallas obviously went to the NBA Finals, those 2 teams basically made it clear that we're on a different level now than what we've done in the previous few years. Dallas went from not even making the play-in 2 years ago to going to the NBA Finals. Minnesota went from a team that had lost in the first round a couple years in a row, and I think a lot of people, including me, were kind of like, are they ever going to get over that hump where they're a team that kind of just sneaks into the playoffs and that doesn't go further? So if you, like I said, maybe not exactly what the Timberwolves and the Mavericks did last year, but if you can do something to that effect where people are like, okay, this team is now ready to be in that upper tier of the Western Conference, to me that should be a goal. And if they can accomplish that, that would be what I would define as a successful season.
Yeah, you know what? I'm going to go with what a former Pel, Larry Nance, said at the start of last year, that he thought the team, well, he didn't think. The team said they wanted to host, be a first round. And I think when I look at this team, look, if I'm thinking that way, I'm out of the play-in by 2 spots and all of that. One thing that Jim and I talked about, I felt, Todd, every single podcast was – maybe not the stigma, but and I get it, right? Play-in team. And then I remember talking to him in that last week. First place, you had a 3-way tie going into the final game of the season in the Western Conference, right? You had a separation of, a game and a half, I think, from spots 4 to 7. So teams that were in the play-in, to your point, were 50 possible win teams and things of that nature. So I think the Western Conference, which leads us to our last topic of what we're looking into maybe going into training camp, how tough is the Western Conference? Moves have been made. Other teams have upgraded. Trades have been made. Even one could be coming here between the T-Wolves and the Knicks and all that. So where's the Western Conference stand?
It's brutal. It's absolutely brutal. No, it is. But you can't sit there and tell me that the Pelicans can't compete with these teams. That I would totally disagree with that. And going back to what we were talking about before, if the Pelicans would have performed even average in clutch games, we are hosting a playoff series. So I just think a lot of it had to do with not finishing games because the talent was definitely there. We saw it on a night in and night out basis. We set the record for road wins for the franchise. It was, it was just tough that a lot of those tough clutch games came at home where we weren't able to finish. I can't believe that the Pelicans aren't going to perform much better in the clutch this season because, again, talent-wise, I think they're going to be able to match up with every team that they play.
Yeah. Sometimes when we talk about the Western Conference, it reminds me of, you know how there's a big, basketball barroom debate about who are the top 5 players of all time, and I've seen people talk about how they tweet out, here's my top 5, and they get hordes of people rushing to Twitter to say, like, no, I disagree with you, and they're like, here's my 12 guys that deserve to be top 5 players, and the person's like, wait, that's where there's a top 5. You can't have 12 guys. And it's kind of like that with the West in terms of, you look at some of these teams and how loaded they are, and you're like, that team's definitely not a play-in team. That team's not. And then you end up with 11 teams that you're like, they're not play-in teams. So, I mean, the bar is so high. To be able to win 49 games the way the Pelicans did last year and still end up in the play-in just kind of speaks for itself as far as how many games you need to win to be assured that you're not going to end up in the play-in. But, I mean, it's brutal with the competition that's out there. I think there's 13 teams that are there's going to be teams that go into the season, and this isn't even the first time this has happened in the West. It's happened in recent years, that go into the season saying we're definitely a playoff team and don't even make the play-in. So that's how many good teams out there that are tough.
And more often than not, it's going to come down to health.
And not just that. We saw teams not make the playoffs last year that were right there. And look, I don't know where San Antonio is going to be, but that guy's pretty good down there. They got in Wembanyama, and that team was playing well. Houston's a tough team. I mean, you start looking at some of those teams, and again, Memphis is a completely different team. With the healthy Jean Morant, they might have had one of the big additions in Zach Edey. So, I mean,
well, that's true, too. But now, okay, you're right. Those teams are going to, in theory, going to be better. But that means that they could possibly knock off some of the upper echelon teams in the Western Conference and even things out where it's not going to be, all right, the top 3, like you said, well, they're going to just dominate San Antonio. They're going to dominate Portland. They're going to dominate, whoever, Houston, whatever. It should even things out. And, to use a term, I mean, a lot of the Western Conference teams just might cannibalize each other.
Yeah, I think the thing is this, as we set the table now to start the new season, the NBA fan wins. I think any game you put on, your home team, your nationally televised games, you're going to watch good basketball. And I think what we see now with the three-point shot, for the most part, any team can come back. Todd, we had fun with you on it, but I think you're right. 20-point leads aren't safe.
No, never.
Which is crazy.
Look, and
right?
This is, you know me, I had PTSD until the clock hits 0. Until you hear the horn. But you see an example. It's not just the Pelicans. You see examples every single night because of the three-point shot where if you're up 20, 25 points in the second quarter or the third quarter, you better keep playing because these runs happen in an instant that you can get back into the game in half a quarter. So you got to keep playing. You got to keep your foot, the pedal to the metal, so to speak. But never relax. Never relax until that horn sounds.
I love it. Well, you just previewed what we're going to get into when we take this quick break. We'll come back. What happened today in the first Pelicans training camp practice here in Nashville? We'll do that. Jim Eichenhofer, Todd Graffagnini, Gus Kattengell will do that right after this. All right, everybody wants to know what we saw, right? Everybody wants to see and know what was practice like. So, guys, let's get right to it. I was talking about it with you guys when we were walking back to the team bus. What's the one thing, the first thing? There's a lot of different things we can touch on, but the one thing that hit you the second you watch practice, Todd?
It's still all about defense. It is, no matter what you see in the NBA nowadays, and I was talking to Antonio Daniels about this after practice was over, the NBA is all about scoring. For the most part, it's not all about defense. And as long as Willie Green is the head coach of the New Orleans Pelicans, it is all about defense. It is defense first. The Pelicans are going to score the basketball. They have too much talent not to. But if you can defend, you are going to give yourself an opportunity to win each and every game. And the first 45 minutes of today's first workout was all about defense. 3 different stations, 3 different sets of players, and they're working on rotations. They're working on working the passing lanes, deflections, steals, and that's what the foundation of this Pelicans franchise is based on. And that, to me, it was a great way to kick off camp.
You'll be able to see this on Pelicans.com if it's not up already when the time you listen to this podcast, but it was interesting to me that, Brandon Ingram and Dejounte Murray did a joint interview as they were kind of wrapping up and getting headed out for the bus to go back to the hotel. It was interesting that Dejounte Murray noted, the Pelicans have been a really good defensive team for the last few years. New Orleans is ranked 6th in defensive efficiency the last 2 seasons. He was with Atlanta the last 2 years. They finished 27th in defense last season, 22nd the year before in the 2 years that he was with the Hawks. And I think he seems really invested in the idea of contributing to the level that he can defensively. He knows that the Pelicans are already a really good team. And like I said, top 10. They finished 6th 2 years in a row. But I think he was all defense with the Spurs going back a handful of years.
Yes.
He was an all-star in 2022. Everybody around the league knows how good of a player he is. But I do think that the accolades that he's gotten defensively for him have dropped, and some of that is because of it's like guilt by association when you play for a team that's not
No doubt about
in
it.
the top rankings defensively. I think he needs to, and I'm sure he wants to get back to the point where people give him the recognition that he deserves for the kind of defensive player he is. And with him being alongside Herb Jones, players already today were talking about the deflections that Dejounte was getting and just the way that he's able to get into the passing lanes. He's so long, especially for a point guard. He's 6'5", but it just seems like he has arms for days out there.
Well, Jim, there's a guy who led the league in deflections a year. There's a guy who led the league in steals in a year. So he is a defender, and I think he's going to fit in rather well. Gus, again, he had a pretty good debut today, even though it was just practice.
I'm chomping at the bit.
Go ahead, man.
At the bit. I love what you just said, Jim, in that he brings so many different elements to it. Leadership is such one. You and I talked about it. Look, there's no secret. It was Dejounte Murray for me that stood out. It was my topic going into this trip, into this training camp. I couldn't wait to see it. We've heard about it, but I wanted to see it because some of the things that what you talked about that prevented this team from being 50-win team or more. Clutch situations, turnovers, spacing, knowing what to do that. This guy has the ability to do that, but he hadn't seen it, right? So I was kind of curious to see it. So let's start with your point there. In those first sets that we saw, the defensive sets and rotations, I counted 3 steals, a handful, if not a half dozen hand deflections, to the point that this is what Zion Williamson said right after practice.
I mean, yeah, there was a few moments where I'm over on the sideline laughing because I'm like, man, he deflected that one too. So, yeah, it's exciting. We just got to figure it out on our end.
So, Jim, when you hear Zion say, man, I'm sitting over here on the side, I'm like, did he really get his hand on that? He was all involved in everything. How can that help the Pelicans?
Yeah, I mean, to be able to have somebody like him and Herb Jones together, to me, just the ability that, defense isn't just about steals, but I mean, it definitely helps a ton to be as disruptive as those two guys are. Maybe you're going to be more successful at keeping other teams out of the paint, and then you don't have to worry as much about the rim protection and the interior defense. But, yeah, I'm really looking forward to just seeing what he can do. And we saw it a lot with the Spurs. I mean, he was a guy that I really did not like playing against at all. I remember
a charter member of the Pop Roaches, by the way.
Yes, I like that.
His last, coincidentally too, his last game for the Spurs was in that play-in game in 2022, and at that point I had no inkling whatsoever that he was. I thought he'd be a Spur forever.
Me too.
So I was kind of happy when he got traded to the East. To be honest with you,
he is the all-time triple-double leader for the San Antonio Spurs franchise.
Interesting
Really?
stat.
Number 1. He's got 17.
There's some big names that have played for the Spurs, too.
And again, he only played there for five years.
Right.
All right, so you add that. Here's what head coach Willie Green had to say. Again, his first chance is just practice one of seeing what he could contribute to this team.
It's going to be fun to watch, having Dejounte and Herb on the floor together, 2 all-defensive players, guys that are leaders, that are tough, and then offensively, he's looking to be one of the league leaders in assists. He understands the weapons that he has on the wing. You got Zion, you got CJ, you got B.I., Herb, Trey coming into the game. We got to put some work in, but there's a ton of potential in this team.
And Todd, I know you love your sayings every now and then. You love your mantras, your things of nature. I mean, you got to fight was one that really, I think, was loved by the Pels fans from head coach Willie Green. How did you like when he and Brandon Ingram were being reminded by somebody post practice today. Hey, there's a lot of people talking about who's going to be all center and how y'all going to get all these rotations down. And did you like what he had to say? In case you forgot, here it is.
I mean, man, let them talk. We here. We got our brothers who we ready to go to war with each and every night. So, we can't control none of that.
I know these players sometimes think that they're in a bubble and they don't hear the outside noise. They're hearing the outside noise. I just think that it's going to give them something more to prove. That, I mean, it's just been a cavalcade of the Pels don't have a 5, and they've been listening to it for months now. I don't think any of these players care a rip about any of it because, again, they got enough talent on the court that they're going to be able to overcome maybe some deficiencies. Look, it's a long season. It's not all going to go smoothly. They'll figure it out. There's just too much talent on the court.
By no means do we know Dejounte well at this point. He's brand new, but I love his initial. I love his demeanor.
Yeah,
he strikes you as a guy who is going to take stuff personally in a good way.
Absolutely.
And a guy that, this isn't, it's not me being the first person to say this, but I've heard various people already from within the organization, including on Media Day, talk about how he's somebody who is a leader in terms of he can be vocal. And I think he's all about business. Like he's not going to mess around. If he sees stuff that needs to be corrected or changed, I think he's going to immediately address it. And having that in the point guard position, I think, is something that is exceptionally valuable, and can't wait to see what kind of impact that has on all the other guys.
He's an alpha, and Gus, we're looking at it during practice. We saw him under the stanchion with Zion Williamson.
I was just going there.
It was all Dejounte telling. Again, we don't know what he was saying, but it was obvious that he was being constructive in whatever it was, and you saw, Zion's nodding his head, and he's fully engaged. Mm-hmm. But the thing is like, look, Dejounte Murray is literally one of the newest Pelicans, and he is very comfortable enough in his role where he's going to go up to your quote-unquote superstar and be like, this is the way that we need this done here.
Remember his introductory press conference? He misunderstood Willie Green when he said it's going to be really difficult to find out how Zion going to do the pick and roll. Willie was talking about it's going to be difficult to defend, and Dejounte interrupted him and said, no, it's not. It's not going to be difficult at all. When he got in there. Right. I think that's what you saw today. And, again, this is no offense to anybody else on the roster. But when you think of the Pelicans the last several years, guys, we all thought, even before the C.J. McCollum trade and even afterwards, where the franchise was going to go was going to be with Brandon Ingram and Zion Williamson, right? Two of its youngest stars, the potential, things of that nature. What stood out to me today, Jim, what Todd just said. I'm watching Dejounte Murray's hand gestures. He's explaining where he wants Zion to go, what to do, where he's going to go. He's the director. He's the conductor. Zion, yes, give it to me. But I also, something stood out in the confidence and almost how he helps B.I., right? And I'm not just talking about on the court. I'm talking about the post-game presser. He was right next to him. And when B.I. was talking, he's staring right at him and he's shaking his head. It's almost like he's right there next to Brandon. He's saying, I'm here to help him, not make it as hard on him, to help him get easy buckets, to do those things. Like, I just already, and again, it's so early, but two of your players that we have focused on, he's right there helping them maybe even grow more and almost kind of taking that, I wouldn't say even deflection, but just, ability and to talk with them, to be supportive for him. It just stood out to me today.
I think he's going to inspire a lot of confidence in the rest of the team. I think with how direct he is, with, his confidence in, okay, this is what we're going to do and this is how we're going to do it, is going to help a ton. It would have been nice to see that on the floor in some of the close games that Todd referenced earlier that ended up losses, games where you had a lead and all you needed to do was execute. I think the execution part of it is going to help so much with what he does, just his personality, but just also the fact that he has so much experience in the NBA playing point guard and being the guy that says, okay, this is how we're going to get organized and we're going to run this. And instead of people looking around like, okay, who's going to run the show here? Yeah. Who's going to get us into the offense? I think there's no question with him at the attack.
Rapid fire here, and then we'll break down and finish with what we're going to see maybe tonight. Is the first day of 2 days where they're actually going to go scrimmage, and we'll get to see that. We'll have that for you tomorrow, obviously. But some things that just stood out. Trey Jamison, man, had an alley-oop dunk on there.
I'm such a fan of
Guy
his.
Is huge.
I'm so happy he's back with the team. I told him yesterday before we got on the plane and we were, walking up. I said, I'm just. It was tough seeing you in that Memphis uniform, man, because I just, look, he started the year with us last year. Mm-hmm. He went through training camp, and he got a better opportunity. And he got to go be with the big club with the Washington Wizards, and then they sent him to Memphis. But the thing about him is that he's a two-way player, so he's going to get some action at some point on the roster. But he is a big body. He can do the dirty work, and he is going to give you max effort every single game. He doesn't take a possession off, and he's just a force. He's a physical force, and that is a player that maybe the Pelicans can use down the road because, look, he played a lot for Memphis last year. He got a lot of NBA game experience on a team that really didn't win a whole lot down the stretch for the Grizzlies. But the fact is he's got the confidence now that he can do it. And I think that is just going to be a world of difference between him going into this training camp as it was last training camp.
I think Pelicans fans are happy to have him back because he was a hero of preseason last year.
So a lot of people win against Orlando.
Yeah, what people saw him do on the court during the preseason games and training camp was very encouraging to the point where when he left, people were disappointed because they thought that he could be part of the future. So great to have him back.
Yep.
A couple of my takeaways, a couple guys that people really haven't talked about that much in the offseason, but if you followed the NBA super, super closely, you watch these two guys and say, like, there's something there. And to me, the two guys I'm referencing are Jamal Cain and Javonte Green. I liked Javonte Green a ton when he played for the Bulls. He was like kind of that Najee Marshall type, hard-nosed guy, athletic, gives you everything he can on the defensive end. And Jamal Cain is just really athletic guy, also somebody I think that can help defensively. Don't know how much of a role either of those two guys are going to have when we get to the real regular season. But, I mean, I like the potential of those guys. And one of the things I love, too, about training camp is you watch some of these players, like those two in particular, from my perspective, and you say, people don't realize how good NBA players are. You watch some of the things that those guys do on the court and how athletic they are in some of the scrimmages or even the practices, and it just kind of blows you away. It's like this is a guy who's been so far kind of a fringe NBA player, like at the edge of the roster, and you watch him play and you're like, this guy is incredible, like some of the stuff that he can do.
And Cain's another two-way player, which means even early on in the season before the G League kicks in, he's going to be with the team. He's going to travel with the team. Yeah. Whether he plays or not, he's going to be going up against these guys in practice every single day, and that's only going to make him better.
He might have had some of the best dunk plays there as well. Lots of ball movement, guys, conditioning. This team had to get 82 layups in a 2-minute period. They didn't do it. They got to within 81 with their right hand, and then AD said, here's where it gets challenging. Now they got to do it with their left hand. Did they do it, Graf?
They did it. They got it to 82 with about a half second left. So it's interesting that they weren't able to get it with most of their strong hands, and then with the quote-unquote weak side, they were able to get to 82. But that's a lot of running up and down the court for 2 minutes, and that was all about conditioning. And as you saw, right after that, it's like, shut it down, let's go, because we're scrimmaging tonight.
We should do that drill sometime, the three of us, see how many we can make in 2 minutes.
Nope.
I'm going to go with 30. I think we can get 30 in. You think we can get 30 in?
I don't know if I'd be able to make 94 feet.
Well, first off, can you go from court to court with the ankle?
No, sir. I'm going to have to hop on one leg.
Okay, well, let's table that idea then.
Let's table that idea.
You can't speed walk a leg drill.
I got you. All right, so we've touched on some of the storylines going into camp, some of the things that stood out in a very brief yet interesting first of 2 practices today. Let's get into what we're going to look at or look forward to for the second practice, which, we'll see some game action. All right, so look, tonight should be fun because, Todd, you've done this. Jim, you've done it. I haven't. Apparently, they're going to scrimmage. Look, this is basketball now. We're going to kind of get to see that. I just mentioned ball movement. That's something I'm going to be interested in. I kept referencing to you. I didn't see a lot of dribbling. This is an offense, and the fans will see here soon enough. That's very specific as to why I'm saying that, but that's something I want to look at when they start scrimmaging.
Yeah, no, and we're just going to see how early on how Willie Green is going to mix and match. Now, again, you're going to have 2 different teams, and the assistants are basically going to run the teams and everything. But I just think how they're going to mix and match early. they're going to get after it tonight. I mean, they will. They're going to get after it tomorrow night as well. So these first two-a-days really set the tone for the rest of camp, because you're only going to have one practice coming up on Thursday. You can have a day off on Friday, and then single practices on Friday and Saturday on Saturday and Sunday before we come back home. So these are pretty important. It's going to give them a chance to get up and down the court, get some shots up, get those defensive rotations, see what combinations are working very, very early. And this is all in preparation for what's going to happen next Monday, which is the first preseason game.
My main two things are, you addressed this a little bit, just the combinations of guys, how certain players play off of each other. And then the second thing for me is just a bunch of the rookie first-year guys, some of the players that came from other teams that we haven't necessarily gotten to see play in NBA competition and situations as much, just to see how some of those guys fare. I think that's something that's going to be really interesting to me. Antonio Reeves, obviously rookie. Yves Missi, another rookie. Two guys that were acquired during the draft. I think those are going to be some of the main guys that I focus on.
Todd, you touched on as we wrap up the first podcast here of training camp, the challenge that head coach Willie Green has to find minutes. What I got yesterday, Jim, over at Media Day and talking to a lot of the players about the depth, that all adds for one word for me that starts with the C, competition. And I think that's going to be very fun to see. I think the better you are, the more competitive guys are trying to get those minutes, the better your other players are going to be, because you can't go out there and not practice hard. You can't go out there and get it done, because somebody's coming for your minutes. Somebody's trying to go out there and play. To your point, Jim, you got guys going to be in Birmingham. They want to play for the parent club. You got guys playing here on the bench. They want to get minutes on the bench, because you got options this year.
Yes, and unfortunately, the reality of the NBA is there's going to be injuries, and you're going to get your opportunity. And that's why this is so important that Willie Green has this time to evaluate some of the younger players that may or may not play. I mean, you think about what happened with Jordan Hawkins last year. At the beginning of the season, Jordan Hawkins got his opportunity because it was available, because players were out. And he made the most of it. And when those players came back, he kind of got lost in the numbers game. But he was able to showcase what he could do because of the opportunity that presented himself, unfortunately, because what is the reality of the NBA, that nobody's playing 82 games anymore.
You're right. There's no such thing.
Unless you're Mikal Bridges.
Who does it for 4, 5, 6 years in a row. You're right. There's no such thing as too much depth in the NBA, the way the league is right now. You mentioned the competition part of it, Gus. That's another reason why I look forward to the scrimmages aspect of it, because, there's only so much you can show in some of the drills in terms of how ready you are to compete against this level, or how much more minutes you deserve. So the scrimmages, I think, and then once we get into preseason games, that's when you really start to see, okay, maybe this guy could play a little bit more this year. Mm-hmm. Maybe he deserves a little bit more of a role.
Well, it's interesting you said it, Graff. It's almost like you were there post-game. As a matter of fact, we'll close out with this. This is head coach Willie Green talking about how everyone will get their opportunity this year.
It's a good problem. We got a really good group, high-character guys. They understand that everyone wants to play. Everyone will get an opportunity at some point. And, we'll continue to work at it.
And that was head coach Willie Green. We'll see what happens tomorrow on the podcast. We'll touch on what we get to see in the scrimmage. Yep. We're going to be here with you throughout the rest of the week, so stick around, and thanks for tuning in to the New Orleans Pelicans Podcast, the official podcast of your New Orleans Pelicans. Jim Eichenhofer, Todd Graffagnini, Gus Kattengell, thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening to the New Orleans Pelicans Podcast. Join us 3 times per week on Pelicans.com, the Pelicans mobile app, the iHeartRadio app, or where you get your podcasts. And be sure to give Jim and Gus a follow on X at Jim_Eichenhofer and GCat_17. We'll see you next time, right here on the New Orleans Pelicans Podcast.